Today's story is titled, My Parents Texted. Your sister gets the $200K house you're paying for. I gave them 3 days, then out. My parents stole my house in the middle of my sister's wedding, and they were smiling when they told me. While 200 guests watched her dance beneath crystal chandeliers, my phone buzzed with a message that made my blood run cold. The $200K house you're paying for is her wedding gift. 15 years of mortgage payments, double shifts, missed vacations, and sacrifices erased in a single sentence. I looked across the ballroom and saw my mother raising her glass toward me, waiting for tears, waiting for me to make a scene. When I confronted her, she leaned close and whispered, "You're single. Renting suits you." Then she walked away, as if my life's work already belonged to someone else. They believed I would stay quiet because I always had. They believed being family gave them the right to take everything from me. So I smiled, toasted the bride, and let them enjoy the final celebration they would ever have inside my house. 1 week later, I placed legal papers on the kitchen table and gave them 3 days to choose. Accept my terms or get out. What they did next exposed secret tenants, forged claims, a hidden land deed, and a woman whose name my mother had tried to bury for decades. Stay until the end, because this betrayal leads to a reversal no one in that ballroom could have predicted. And when the truth finally comes out, the people who treated me like nothing will lose far more than a house. My name is Diana Patterson. I am 38 years old, and I work as an office manager for a small accounting firm in Sacramento. I have never considered myself extraordinary, but I learned early how to survive by working harder than anyone expected and asking for very little in return. For most of my life, that made me the dependable daughter, the one everyone called when bills were due, plans fell apart, or someone needed rescuing. After I left my sister's wedding, I drove home with my mother's words still burning in my ears. She had spoken as if the house were already gone, as if 15 years of payments and sacrifices could be erased because she had decided my sister needed it more. I sat in my car beneath the porch light and stared at the place I had spent most of my adult life trying to protect. The white trim needed repainting. One of the porch steps had begun to sag. The maple tree near the sidewalk had grown tall enough to shade the upstairs windows. None of it looked impressive compared with the wedding venue I had just left, but every board, every repair, and every monthly payment carried a piece of my life. I had started saving for the house when I was 20. During the day, I worked at Henderson and Associates, answering phones, preparing invoices, organizing tax files, and doing whatever no one else wanted to do. At night, I waited tables at an Italian restaurant downtown where wealthy couples celebrated anniversaries over expensive wine. I learned to smile through aching feet, rude customers, and 12-hour days because every tip brought me closer to a down payment. For more than 2 years, I lived as if wanting anything for myself were a luxury. I bought clothes from thrift stores, turned down vacations, and ate the cheapest meals I could make. My friends stopped inviting me out because I always said no. I told myself loneliness was temporary. Security would last. By the time I was 23, I had saved $40,000. The house on Oak Street was old, modest, and badly in need of repairs, but it was mine. I still remember sitting at the closing table, signing page after page, while my hands trembled from exhaustion and pride. I did not understand every sentence in those documents. I only understood that I had done something no one in my family believed I could do. 6 months later, my parents asked to move in. Dad had lost his job at a hardware store after a disagreement with a new manager. Mom had not worked steadily in years. They promised it would be temporary, just until they recovered. I gave them the upstairs bedroom with the bay window and cleared space in the bathroom. I told myself good daughters helped their parents. At first, I believed they would contribute when they could. Dad occasionally bought groceries, or slipped a few dollars onto the kitchen counter, but they never paid rent. Months became years. Years became nearly 15. I paid the mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, and every repair. When the roof leaked after a winter storm, I put $12,000 on a credit card, and spent 3 years paying it off. When the water heater failed, I replaced it. When the fence collapsed, I rebuilt it. My parents stayed, and I kept telling myself that family was worth the sacrifice. The morning after the wedding, I opened my utility statements at the kitchen table and noticed something I had ignored for several months. The electric bill had nearly doubled. So had the water and gas. I called the utility company and asked whether there had been a rate increase or an error. The representative told me the usage had changed, not the rates. Someone in the house was consuming much more power and water than before. I began thinking about the unfamiliar cars I had seen in the driveway. A gray Honda had been parked outside before sunrise one Tuesday. A woman I did not know had carried 2 suitcases through the front door a few weeks earlier. I had assumed they were church friends of my mother. That evening, I checked the footage from my doorbell camera. What I found made my stomach tighten. A man in his 30s had arrived carrying a duffel bag. My mother greeted him on the porch, led him upstairs, and accepted cash from him the following morning. He stayed for almost 3 weeks. Before him, there had been a middle-aged woman. After him, a young couple. All of them used the 3rd bedroom, the room where I kept boxes and old furniture. My mother had turned it into a private rental without asking me, and had been keeping every dollar. I watched one recording twice. She stood beneath the porch light, counting bills with the careful satisfaction of someone collecting money she believed she had earned. That was the moment something inside me changed. She was not simply depending on me. She was profiting from me. 2 days later, my next-door neighbor, Fran Mitchell, called while I was still studying the utility bills. Fran was 70, a retired accountant, and the kind of woman who noticed when a curtain moved in a house 3 doors away. Her voice sounded unusually serious. She told me she had seen something strange in the county property records connected to my address and advised me to examine my ownership documents immediately. Before hanging up, she mentioned something else. Years earlier, an elderly woman had sometimes stood across the street staring at my house. Fran had assumed she was a former resident or someone who remembered the neighborhood. I looked through the kitchen window toward the dark sidewalk and felt a chill I could not explain. My mother had been making money from my home, but somewhere inside the county records was another secret, one that had apparently begun long before I knew anyone was watching. Fran's warning stayed with me through the night, and by morning I had stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I took the day off work, gathered every mortgage statement I could find, and drove to the bank that had handled my loan since I bought the house. The building looked exactly as I remembered from closing day. Polished floors, quiet voices, and people pretending money was never personal. A loan officer named Richard Torres pulled up my account and confirmed what I had always believed. I was the only borrower. I had made every payment. My parents' names appeared nowhere on the mortgage. For one brief moment, relief loosened the knot in my chest. Then Richard frowned at the screen and asked whether anyone had ever explained the ground lease to me. I told him I did not know what he meant. He turned the monitor slightly and showed me a document recorded with the property transaction in 2010. According to the agreement, I owned the house, the improvements, and a 99-year leasehold interest in the land. The ground itself belonged to a woman named Helen Morrison. The lease charged a symbolic amount and gave me the right to live there, maintain the property, and pass my interest to an heir, but the underlying title had never transferred to me. Richard explained that arrangements like this were uncommon for ordinary homes but not impossible. The bank had financed my leasehold interest and the structure because the agreement was long-term and properly recorded. I stared at the document, trying to remember the closing table 15 years earlier. I had been exhausted, terrified, and desperate to hear the words, "The house is yours." I had signed page after page, without understanding how one piece of land could belong to one person while the house on it belonged to another. The name Helen Morrison meant nothing to me. Richard printed the relevant records, including an older deed showing that Helen had acquired the vacant parcel in 1985. The current house had been built later. Nothing in the file explained why she had retained the land or why she had approved such favorable terms when I bought the house. I left the bank with a folder on the passenger seat and the strange feeling that my own home had become evidence in someone else's unfinished story. At the county records office, I confirmed the same information. Helen Morrison still held title to the land. The ground lease remained active. There were also recent inquiries tied to the property, including requests for copies of tax and ownership documents. The clerk would not tell me who had requested them without a formal process, but I already suspected my mother. I searched Helen's name from my car. After several dead ends, I found a public reference connecting an 89-year-old Helen Morrison to Street, Mary's nursing home in Sacramento, a memory care facility. I wrote down the address, though I had no idea what I would say if I went there. Before I could decide, I remembered the other person connected to the house. Nina. I texted her and asked to meet me for coffee. She agreed quickly and chose a cafe far from her neighborhood. When she arrived, she looked nothing like the radiant bride from the wedding. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen, and she kept checking her phone before placing it face down on the table. I told her about the message and asked whether she knew our parents planned to give her my house. Nina's hands began to shake. She said the message had come from her phone, but she had not written it. While she was changing before the reception, Mom had picked up the phone and sent it herself. Later, Mom admitted she wanted to see whether I would finally react or continue swallowing every insult. Nina said she had learned about the plan only after the message was sent. Mom had been talking for months about how I did not need the house and how Nina deserved it because she was starting a family. Nina had resisted, but not strongly enough. Then she told me why. David controlled every account, every credit card, and every purchase. He gave her a small monthly allowance and demanded receipts. She had no savings, no independent income, and no way to leave without his permission. As she spoke, her phone lit up 3 times. Each time, she flinched before turning it over. I asked whether she felt safe. She hesitated too long. Then she whispered that she was pregnant, and David was not the father. The baby belonged to Marcus, a man she had known years earlier and had reconnected with before the wedding. She knew what she had done was wrong, but she had been lonely, frightened, and trapped. She wanted to leave David before he discovered the truth, but she had nowhere to go. Mom had suggested that if Nina accepted the house, she could sell it later and use the money to start over. For one terrible moment, Nina had considered it. She covered her face and said she hated herself for even thinking about taking what I had worked for. I reached across the table and told her the house was not hers to accept, but my door was still open to her. That was when I understood the cruelty of my mother's plan. She had not simply chosen one daughter over the other. She had created a situation where Nina's fear depended on my surrender. We had been taught to see each other as rivals when, in truth, we were 2 women being controlled in different ways. I had come to the cafe expecting to confront the sister who was stealing my home. Instead, I left knowing the real enemy was the person who had convinced both of us that survival required betraying the other. The realization that Nina and I had been manipulated by the same person changed the direction of everything. I no longer wanted only to defend the house. I wanted to understand how far my mother had gone, what those property records meant, and why the name Helen Morrison had been hidden from us for so long. Fran gave me the number of a lawyer named Margaret Hale, a woman she described as careful, relentless, and nearly impossible to intimidate. Margaret specialized in real estate disputes and elder law, which made her seem like the right person to untangle both the ownership problem and the fact that my parents had lived in the house for almost 15 years. Her office was in a restored brick building downtown, quiet and polished without feeling cold. She greeted me herself, a composed woman in her early 60s, with silver hair, clear green eyes, and the kind of calm voice that made panic feel embarrassing. I spread my documents across her desk and told her everything from the wedding message to the secret tenants, the ground lease, and Nina's confession. Margaret listened without interrupting. She took notes, asked precise questions, and made me repeat dates whenever something sounded uncertain. When I finished, She explained that my mother could not legally give the house to Nina because she did not own it. My parents were long-term occupants, but that did not make them owners. At the same time, Margaret warned me not to act on anger. I could not throw their belongings onto the lawn, change the locks, or order them out in 3 days, simply because I paid the bills. Their long residency meant any termination of occupancy had to follow formal procedures, and one mistake could turn a strong case into a costly mess. Then she examined the copies from the county office. She focused on the recent document requests and the notes connected to a title company. After several phone calls and a search of public filings, she found the outline of what my mother had been attempting. Claire had been preparing an affidavit claiming that she and my father had supplied the original down payment, while I had merely qualified for the loan and held title for the family's benefit. If filed, the claim could support an argument that I was holding the property under a resulting or constructive trust. Margaret made it clear that the claim looked weak, but weak did not mean harmless. If my mother created enough confusion around the source of the money, she could delay a sale, frighten a lender, or drag the dispute into court. I told Margaret that every dollar of the down payment had come from my own savings. She asked for the original bank transfer, cashier's check, or settlement receipt. I searched through my folder and found nothing. The closing statement confirmed the amount, but did not show the account from which the funds had come. For the first time since I entered her office, Margaret looked concerned. She said there were ways to reconstruct the record, but the missing receipt gave my mother exactly the opening she appeared to be preparing to use. I felt foolish for not keeping every document, even though 15 years had passed, and I had never imagined needing to prove my own sacrifice to my parents. Margaret told me not to blame myself. People rarely preserve evidence against betrayal they do not yet expect. She then turned to the ground lease. At first, she read it with the same professional detachment she had shown toward everything else. Then she reached the page, listing the landowner's full name. Her fingers stopped moving. She read the line again and took off her glasses. The change in her face was so sudden that I asked whether she was feeling ill. Margaret did not answer immediately. She stood, walked to the window, and remained there with her back to me. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. Morrison, she explained, was not merely a name she recognized from legal records. It was her birth name. Helen Morrison was the woman who had given birth to her and surrendered her when she was very young. Margaret had been raised by another family and later used Hale professionally, but she had never forgotten the name on her earliest papers. She had spent years searching for Helen, then stopped after learning that her mother had another daughter. That daughter had been born around 1965 and had remained with Helen for only a few years before disappearing into state care. Margaret had once driven past an address connected to the family, but could not bring herself to knock. She had never known the second daughter's adult name. I told her my mother's birth year. Then I told her that Claire had spent part of her childhood in an orphanage and refused to discuss anything that happened before she met my father. Margaret sat down slowly. Neither of us said the conclusion aloud at first. Helen could be my grandmother. Margaret could be my mother's sister. The lawyer I had hired that morning might be my aunt. Margaret pulled the land records closer and traced the dates with one finger. Helen acquired the land in 1985. The house was built later. The leasehold transaction in my name had been approved when I bought the property. None of that could be accidental. Someone had arranged for me to receive unusually favorable rights, and that person shared blood with both my mother and the woman sitting across from me. Margaret said we needed more than suspicion. We needed Helen's original records, estate documents, and any evidence explaining why she had kept the land. She called Street Mary's nursing home and confirmed that Helen was still there in memory care. Before ending the call, Margaret asked whether Helen had ever left instructions for visitors. The nurse hesitated, then said there was a locked box in their safe that Helen had insisted must be preserved. It was meant for a woman she could not name, someone she described only as carrying sadness in her eyes. I remembered a card I had received after closing on the house, unsigned except for one sentence telling me to keep going because the home was mine. I had assumed it came from a coworker. Now I was no longer sure. Margaret looked at the clock and closed the folder. We had begun the day as attorney and client. By the time we left for the nursing home, we were two women following the same buried name toward a truth neither of us had been prepared to find. Margaret and I drove to Street Mary's in near silence, each of us carrying a different version of the same fear. She was about to face the mother who had disappeared from her life, while I was about to meet a grandmother whose name had somehow become tied to the ground beneath my home. The nursing facility sat behind a row of old oak trees, quiet and carefully maintained, with flower beds arranged around a circular driveway. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and disinfectant. A nurse led us through the memory care wing and warned us that Helen's dementia was advanced. She had not spoken clearly in months and rarely recognized anyone. Helen was sitting beside a window when we entered. She was small and fragile, with white hair pinned loosely at the back of her head and hands resting motionless in her lap. Her eyes remained fixed on the garden outside. Margaret stopped several feet away, suddenly looking less like a formidable attorney and more like a daughter who had waited too long for an answer. She introduced herself softly, giving her birth year and explaining who she was. Helen did not turn. Margaret tried again, her voice breaking, as she said she had spent most of her life wondering why she had been given away. There was no response. I touched Margaret's shoulder, but there was nothing I could say that would make the moment less cruel. The woman she had searched for was physically present, yet the disease had taken away any possibility of recognition. The nurse waited respectfully near the door, then told us Helen had left something in the facility safe before her condition became severe. She had given strict instructions that it should be handed to a particular visitor. She could not remember a name, only a description Helen had repeated several times. The box was for the girl with sad eyes who carried the weight of everyone around her. The nurse looked at me when she said it. A few minutes later, she returned with a wooden box secured by a small brass lock. The key had been kept in Helen's file. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were several documents wrapped in tissue paper, a packet of photographs, and 2 letters. The first pages were records of Margaret's adoption. The next was my mother's birth certificate, followed by paperwork showing that she had entered state care as a small child. Margaret read each document slowly, as if every line rearranged the history she thought she knew. One of the letters had been written by Helen in 2022, when she was still capable of explaining her choices. I read it aloud. Helen wrote that she had given birth to Margaret at 27 while unmarried and living in deep poverty. She surrendered her because she believed another family could offer what she could not. 2 years later, she had my mother and tried to keep her, convinced that determination alone could make her a better parent. It did not. Helen admitted that she was angry, unstable, and often cruel. Eventually, she placed Claire in an orphanage, telling herself that separation was an act of mercy. Instead, it became the wound that shaped my mother's entire life. Helen tried to find her years later, but Claire refused every attempt at contact. In 1985, Helen purchased a vacant parcel on Oak Street. She had hoped to build a modest home there and offer it to her daughter as proof that she could finally provide something permanent. Claire rejected the offer and disappeared again. Helen kept the land. The house was constructed later, and ownership of the structure changed hands while Helen retained the underlying parcel. Years afterward, she learned that I was working 2 jobs and saving to buy that very house. She did not purchase the land for me. She already owned it. What she did was approve a 99-year ground lease with symbolic rent, allowing me to buy and control the house without surrendering the land to anyone who might pressure me into transferring it. She wrote that she had watched from a distance because she feared approaching me would drive Claire further into resentment. She sent the unsigned card after my closing and occasionally asked Fran whether I was safe. The old woman seen across the street had been Helen herself. The final documents in the box concerned a living trust created in 2022. Helen had placed the land into the trust and named me as the successor beneficiary. Margaret explained that this did not mean I immediately owned the ground. Helen was still alive, and the trust had to be administered properly after her death. Until then, my strongest protection remained the ground lease and my ownership of the house. Still, the purpose behind the arrangement was unmistakable. Helen had designed it so Claire could never truthfully claim complete control over the property. I looked at the woman by the window and struggled with what I felt. She had abandoned both of her daughters in different ways. Her later efforts did not erase the harm she had caused. Yet she had also spent decades trying to prevent that harm from reaching me. Margaret sat beside her mother and took her hand. Helen did not react, but Margaret held on anyway. Before we left, I placed the unsigned card on the table beside Helen's bed. For 15 years, I had believed my house stood only on sacrifice. Now I knew it also stood on regret, secrecy, and one old woman's attempt to protect a granddaughter she never had the courage to meet. The truth inside Helen's box did not make my next decision easier. It made it heavier. For the first time, I understood that the house was connected to more than money and betrayal. It carried my grandmother's regret, my mother's anger, Margaret's abandonment, and my own years of sacrifice. Still, understanding the past did not erase what Claire had done in the present. When I returned home, I found both of my parents in the living room. Dad sat with the newspaper folded across his lap. Mom was arranging flowers for a church luncheon, calmly trimming stems, as if she had not tried to give away the roof over my head. I placed a folder on the coffee table and told them we needed to talk. Claire glanced at it, then at me, with the irritated patience she usually reserved for people she considered unreasonable. I told her I knew about Helen, the ground lease, the title requests, the private renters, and the affidavit she had been preparing. For the first time in my life, my mother had no immediate answer. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but I saw fear pass across her face before pride covered it. She said I was misunderstanding everything. According to her, the house had always been a family investment. She and Dad had supported me when I bought it, and my name had only been used because I had the steady income required for the loan. I asked her how much she had contributed to the down payment. She avoided the question and said families did not keep score. I almost laughed. She had been keeping score my entire life. She simply objected when the numbers no longer favored her. I opened the folder and gave them two choices. The first was a formal lease. They could remain in the house at a reduced monthly rent, but they would have to acknowledge in writing that I owned the structure and held the leasehold rights. They would stop renting rooms to strangers, contribute to utilities, and publicly correct the false story that the property belonged to them. The second choice was to leave voluntarily. I would provide enough money for moving costs, a deposit, and several months of rent elsewhere. I was not trying to make them homeless. I was trying to end an arrangement that had survived only because I had been too afraid to set boundaries. Dad read both documents without speaking. Claire did not touch them. Her eyes had settled on one phrase in the lease mentioning Helen's trust. She asked whether the money I was offering came from her mother. I said it would come from me. She called it the same thing. To her, every option was another attempt by Helen to control her from beyond the walls of the nursing home. She said Helen had bought the land to remind her that she would never own anything, then used me as the final weapon. I told her the house had never been hers to lose. That was when she stood and accused me of playing God. She said I was enjoying the chance to make her beg for permission to stay in the home she had cared for. I reminded her that she had collected rent from strangers while I paid the bills. Her face tightened, but she did not deny it. Instead, she said she had earned that money by maintaining the household. Dad looked down at the floor. His silence felt less like agreement than surrender. I gave them time to consider the choices, but Claire refused both before I finished speaking. She would not sign a lease, accept money, or admit wrongdoing in front of the church. She said she would rather fight. I wanted them out in 30 days. Margaret told me that anger did not determine legal deadlines. Because my parents had occupied the house for many years, the notice had to be prepared carefully and served under the correct classification. I hated hearing that, but I followed her advice. She drafted the proper termination documents and warned me not to change locks, remove belongings, or shut off utilities. Claire responded by disappearing for 2 days. When she returned, she brought a lawyer named Gerald Brennan. He wore a shiny suit, carried a worn briefcase, and spoke with the confidence of a man accustomed to frightening people who did not understand the law. Gerald said Claire and Bob had supplied the original $40,000 down payment and that I had held the property for the family's benefit. He planned to pursue a resulting trust or constructive trust, claiming that legal title did not reflect the true ownership arrangement. Margaret had already warned me this might happen, but hearing the accusations spoken aloud still made me feel sick. Gerald asked whether I had the original transfer record showing the money came from my account. I opened my files and discovered the receipt was missing. The closing statement showed the amount, but not the source. Gerald smiled when he saw my hesitation. He said memories faded, documents disappeared, and judges often looked beyond names on paper when families mixed money and property. After he left, I called Margaret. She investigated him and found a disciplinary history involving misleading filings and dubious tenancy claims. She warned him that any false statement would be reported. Gerald withdrew from representing Claire formally, but the damage was done. My mother now knew exactly where my evidence was weakest. A few days later, 12 women from her church arrived at my door. I expected them to condemn me. Instead, they described years of subtle insults, manipulation, and control. Then one elderly woman told me Claire had once driven her to a shelter in the middle of the night and saved her from a violent husband. That story unsettled me more than the accusations. My mother was capable of courage and generosity. She simply seemed to reserve them for people whose gratitude did not threaten her authority. That evening, Claire again claimed she had paid for my house. Dad sat beside her, pale and silent. Then I noticed his right hand move toward the inside pocket of his coat. He stopped before taking anything out, but his eyes met mine for one brief second. I had spent days believing the most important receipt had vanished. In that moment, I realized my father might know exactly where it was. The next morning, Dad was waiting for me at the kitchen table before I left for work. His coffee had gone cold, and the newspaper beside him had not been opened. Without looking up, he reached into the same inside pocket I had noticed the night before and placed a yellowed envelope between us. My name was written across the front in his careful block letters. Inside was the original receipt for the $40,000 down payment, along with a bank record showing the money had come directly from my savings account. I stared at the date, the account number, and my own signature until the words blurred. For days, I had been terrified that my mother could rewrite the beginning of my homeownership simply because one document had disappeared. Dad had been carrying the truth against his chest. I asked how long he had kept it. He said he found the receipt years earlier after Claire removed several papers from my filing cabinet. She told him she was only organizing them, but he had already learned that her idea of organization often meant hiding anything that weakened the story she wanted others to believe. He made a copy, then kept the original where she could not find it. I wanted to feel grateful, but anger came first. If he knew what she was doing, why had he remained silent? Dad flinched, yet he did not defend himself. Instead, he went upstairs and returned with a small black USB drive. He explained that around 2018 he had begun saving emails, photographs, and a few voice recordings whenever Claire discussed the house. He did not have 15 years of perfect evidence. He had only started after she tried to persuade him to sign a statement saying they had paid for my down payment. He refused, but the incident frightened him enough to begin documenting what he could. Some files showed her referring to the property as Diana's house when speaking privately. In one recording, she admitted that I had paid every major expense and complained that I was too stubborn to transfer the title willingly. Another contained photographs of documents she had prepared for the county office. None of it could replace formal records, but Margaret later said it would make Claire's ownership claim nearly impossible to defend honestly. I asked Dad whether he had kept those files to protect me or to protect himself. He looked older than I had ever seen him. He said he had spent years telling himself that silence kept the family together. In reality, It had only allowed Claire to make each of us doubt our own memories. He gave me the evidence with one condition. He asked me to use it to free myself, not to humiliate her. I told him I could not promise mercy before I knew the full truth. That afternoon, Nina called from a grocery store parking lot. David had discovered she had been meeting with me and demanded access to her phone. When she refused, he froze the only card she could use and told her she would have nothing if she left him. She had packed one suitcase and driven away while he was at work. I told her to come directly to the house. When she arrived, she looked terrified, but she also looked more awake than she had at the cafe. For the first time, fear was moving her forward instead of holding her still. Claire came downstairs as Nina carried the suitcase through the door. Her face hardened when she realized what was happening. She accused me of helping Nina destroy her marriage and said David could provide security that neither of us understood how to appreciate. Nina asked whether security meant having to beg permission to buy shampoo. Claire called that discipline. Then Nina said the sentence that finally shattered the performance between them. She told our mother that David had never been chosen because he loved her. He had been chosen because his family looked successful in photographs. Claire slapped the kitchen counter with her palm and said she had sacrificed everything to make sure Nina would never struggle the way she had. Nina answered that being controlled by a rich man was still being controlled. The argument ended when Claire noticed Nina's hand resting protectively over her stomach. For 1 second, something raw crossed my mother's face. It was not simple anger. It looked like panic, memory, and grief arriving all at once. She left the room without asking about the baby. Dad watched her go, then stared at the floor. Before I could question him, Margaret called. Helen had died peacefully during the night. The news landed with a strange mixture of sorrow and emptiness. I had met my grandmother only once, and she had not known who I was, yet her decisions had shaped my entire adult life. Margaret explained that the living trust named me as successor beneficiary, and that she would begin the formal process of transferring the land. The transfer still required documents and proper administration, but there was no competing beneficiary and no uncertainty about Helen's intent. Later that evening, Margaret brought me Helen's final letter. My grandmother did not ask me to forgive Claire. She admitted that regret had made her want to repair damage that could never be fully repaired. She wrote that my mother needed a home, but I needed freedom, and those needs were not the same thing. Her final instruction was simple: choose for yourself. I folded the letter and found Dad standing in the doorway, holding an old wooden box filled with faded photographs. On top was a picture of a little boy I had never seen. He had my mother's eyes and Dad's smile. When I asked who he was, Dad sat down heavily and said there was something else our family had erased. Before me, before Nina, there had been another child, and his death had changed my mother into the woman I knew. Dad placed the photograph on the table between us and told me the little boy's name was Michael. He had been born several years before me, when my parents were young, frightened, and barely able to pay rent. Michael was bright, affectionate, and always asking questions, but when he was 3 years old, he developed a serious infection. At first, Mom believed it was only a fever. By the time they understood how sick he was, they had no insurance, no savings, and no one they trusted enough to ask for help. Dad said they delayed taking him to the hospital because they were terrified of the cost. When they finally went, the doctors could not save him. I sat there staring at the photograph, while the meaning of my mother's entire life shifted before me. Her obsession with money, appearances, and control had not begun with me or Nina. It had begun in a hospital room where she watched her first child die and decided poverty was the enemy she would never allow near her family again. Dad said she repeated the same sentence for years afterward. She would never be poor again. She would never lose another child because she had nothing. What began as fear slowly hardened into a way of living. She judged every choice by whether it looked safe, respectable, and successful from the outside. She pushed Nina toward David because his family had money. She treated my independence as a threat because I could not be managed through fear. She clung to the house because, to her, a home was not simply shelter. It was proof that she had defeated the powerless girl she once was. None of that excused what she had done, but it gave her cruelty a shape. Dad had more to confess. After Michael died, Mom tried to end her life. Years later, when the pressure of raising two daughters and maintaining the perfect image became too much, she tried again. Dad had hidden both incidents from everyone. He believed that if the truth became public, she would be ashamed beyond recovery. He also believed keeping her calm was more important than confronting her. I asked him whether he understood what that choice had cost us. He lowered his head and said he did now. He had protected Mom's survival, but he had done it by sacrificing our happiness. Hearing him admit it did not erase the years when he watched her belittle me and said nothing. Still, it was the first honest sentence he had offered without being cornered. Margaret arranged a formal mediation before the property dispute reached a full hearing. By then, the evidence against Mom's ownership claim was overwhelming. I could use the receipt, the recordings, the trust records, and the ground lease to force the matter forward. I could insist that both of my parents leave. I could offer a standard lease with market rent. I could sell the property and walk away from all of them. For several nights, I considered each option. Revenge felt powerful when I imagined it, but less satisfying when I pictured Dad packing his life into boxes, or Mom standing on a sidewalk with nowhere to direct her anger except inward. Nina asked me not to let our mother turn me into another person who confused punishment with strength. Margaret reminded me that justice did not always need an audience. At the mediation table, Mom arrived prepared for war. She sat rigidly beside a new attorney and refused to look at me. The mediator asked what outcome I wanted. I surprised everyone by presenting a fourth option. My parents could remain in the house under a formal lease with symbolic rent, but only under strict conditions. They had to attend family therapy for 6 months. Mom had to acknowledge in writing that the house and leasehold belonged to me. She had to stop all unauthorized rentals, contribute to household expenses, and make a truthful public statement correcting the story she had told at church. Any serious violation would end the agreement immediately. Mom stared at me as if I had offered her a cage. She said I was punishing her with kindness because kindness made it impossible for her to call me cruel. I told her the agreement was not kindness. It was accountability with a door still open. She accused me of wanting to make her the villain forever. I said I wanted her to become human enough to admit she had caused harm. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then Dad signed first. Mom watched him, furious and betrayed, but eventually she signed as well. The first therapy session took place 2 weeks later with a counselor named Dr. Reynolds, a woman in her 60s who had the patience of someone accustomed to families arriving with rehearsed defenses. Mom called therapy an excuse for weak people to blame their parents. Dr. Reynolds did not argue. She simply asked what Mom had wanted to become when she was 10 years old. The question broke through her faster than any accusation had. Mom stared at the floor and whispered that she had wanted to be a teacher. At the orphanage, an adult had told her she was too slow, too difficult, and too poor to become anything important. She had spent the rest of her life trying to prove that person wrong. Dr. Reynolds asked whether proving herself had made her children feel safe. Mom began to cry. She admitted that she had demanded perfection because she believed weakness invited abandonment. In trying to protect us from humiliation, she had made humiliation the language of our home. Near the end of the session, she handed me an old diary. One entry from 1985 mentioned Helen, claiming she had sent money and an apology. Mom had written that she never received either one and believed the promise was another lie. I looked at the faded line and felt the past open again. Michael's death had explained my mother's fear, but somewhere in that missing letter was a truth none of us had yet uncovered. The missing letter stayed in my mind long after that first therapy session ended. Mom insisted it proved nothing except that Helen had spent decades making promises she never kept, but Dr. Reynolds asked her to leave room for the possibility that the truth was more complicated. Over the next few months, our family changed in small, uneven ways. Therapy did not transform Mom overnight. She still corrected everyone's choices, still tried to take control when she felt frightened, and still became defensive whenever Michael's name came up. The difference was that now we stopped pretending those reactions were normal. Dad spoke, instead of disappearing behind a newspaper. Nina challenged Mom without apologizing for it. I learned to say no without explaining myself for 20 minutes afterward. Then, in early autumn, Nina went into labor. I stayed with her at the hospital, while Marcus waited nervously in the hallway, unsure whether he had earned the right to come inside. Nina had not forgiven him for entering her life while she was still married, but she had decided he deserved the chance to be present for his daughter. After hours of pain and fear, Nina gave birth to a healthy baby girl, with dark hair and a fierce cry. When the nurse asked for the child's name, Nina looked at me and said, "Helen." I was surprised, and so was Mom when she arrived later that afternoon. Nina explained that the name was not meant to excuse the woman our grandmother had been. It was meant to remember that one generation's mistakes did not have to become the next generation's destiny. Mom stood beside the hospital bed and stared at the baby for a long time. Then she told Nina she was sorry for pushing her toward David because his family looked secure. Nina said she had spent years believing love could be withdrawn the moment she disappointed her. Mom answered that she had believed the same thing about every person who ever cared for her. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was the first apology between them that did not contain an excuse. The discovery came 3 weeks later, after a heavy storm flooded part of the backyard. A pipe beneath the kitchen floor began leaking, and the plumber said he needed access to an old crawl space that had been sealed during construction. Dad remembered that part of the house had once been connected to a storage shed that stood on the property before the current structure was finished. When the plumber removed a warped section of flooring, he found a narrow cavity between the foundation wall and an older support beam. Inside was a wooden box covered in dust and wrapped in brittle cloth. The hinges were rusted, but the wood had protected the contents from most of the moisture. I called Margaret before opening it. She arrived with gloves, document sleeves, and the serious expression she wore when emotion threatened to interfere with evidence. Inside the box was a bundle of returned mail, property receipts, and one envelope addressed to my mother under a name she had used briefly after leaving state care. A faded postal stamp from May 1985 marked it, "Return to sender. No forwarding address." Mom sat at the kitchen table while Margaret carefully opened it. The letter was from Helen. She wrote that she had sold a small piece of inherited property and borrowed against the Oak Street land. Enclosed was a check for $50,000. Helen begged Mom to use it for housing, medical care, or anything the family needed. She admitted she had no right to expect forgiveness, but she asked for one chance to help without demanding a relationship in return. The date was 2 months before Michael died. No one spoke after Margaret finished reading. Mom stared at the check as though it were something alive. It had expired decades earlier and was worth nothing now, but its existence changed the story she had told herself for 40 years. Helen had sent the money. The letter had not reached her because she had left without providing an address. Mom whispered that if she had stayed, if she had written back, if she had allowed anyone to know where she was, Michael might have received treatment sooner. I stopped her before she could turn the discovery into a simple sentence of blame. We could not know whether the money would have saved him. The illness may already have been too advanced. A different hospital might still have failed. Poverty, fear, pride, and delayed care had all played a part. The truth was painful enough without reducing it to the idea that one decision had killed her child. Mom covered her face and cried in a way I had never seen before, without performance, anger, or an audience to impress. For the first time, she grieved both Michael and the help she had refused to believe was real. The legal dispute ended soon afterward. Mom signed a dismissal of her ownership claim with prejudice, acknowledging that she had no financial or legal interest in the property. Margaret filed the settlement, and I withdrew the eviction action, once both of my parents signed the lease and complied with its conditions. There was no triumphant courtroom speech, only paperwork, signatures, and a judge who reminded us privately that ending a case was not the same as healing a family. On the following Sunday, Mom stood before the congregation at Street Andrews and read a statement she had written herself. She admitted that she had built a public image of generosity while controlling and humiliating the people closest to her. She did not blame Helen, the orphanage, Michael's death, or Dad's silence. She said those things explained her fear, but they did not excuse what she had done with it. When she finished, the church remained silent. Then the 12 women who had once come to my door stood one by one and walked to her side. They did not tell her everything was forgiven. They told her the truth had finally begun. By then, the land transfer through Helen's trust had been completed, and the house was legally secure. I had fought for it, documented it, defended it, and finally won. What no one knew was that winning had changed what I wanted. For the first time, I could look at the walls around me and admit that freedom might not mean keeping the house at all. Looking back, I no longer believe this story was truly about a house. The house was only the place where years of silence, sacrifice, fear, and control finally became impossible to ignore. What mattered most was learning that love without boundaries can become permission for people to keep hurting you. Family does not have the right to take your money, rewrite your history, humiliate you, or demand your silence simply because you share blood. At the same time, understanding someone's pain does not mean excusing the damage they cause. Claire's childhood, Michael's death, and Helen's failures explained many of her choices, but accountability was still necessary before healing could begin. My advice is simple. Keep records when money and property are involved, even with relatives. Ask questions before signing legal documents. Do not ignore small acts of control because they are presented as concern, tradition, or sacrifice. When something feels wrong, speak early, seek professional advice, and set clear boundaries before resentment becomes a crisis. But do not confuse revenge with freedom. Destroying another person may feel satisfying for a moment, yet real victory comes when their behavior no longer controls your decisions. Forgiveness should never be forced, and reconciliation should never happen without truth, responsibility, and lasting change. In the end, I did not win because I proved my mother wrong. I won because I finally stopped abandoning myself to keep everyone else comfortable.